Emma stood in the crowded airport terminal, her carry-on bag slung over one shoulder as she scrolled through her phone. The delay on her flight had stretched into its third hour, and the frustration on her face was impossible to miss. She glanced at the rows of tired travelers slumped in chairs and sighed. It was just another inconvenience in a week that had been full of them. Little did she know, this seemingly ordinary day would take a turn she could never have predicted. As Emma boarded the plane, grateful for her window seat in the quiet corner of coach, she noticed a tall man in a crisp military uniform moving down the aisle. His name tag read Anderson. He looked young, yet his expression carried an unmistakable weariness. Emma couldn't help but wonder about his story. The uniform, the scars barely visible on his hand. What had this man been through? But as the plane filled, the hum of conversations and the clinking of luggage made her push the thoughts aside. When the plane took off, the stranger in uniform settled into the seat beside Emma. Their eyes met briefly, but no words were exchanged. Emma put on her headphones, ready to ignore the world for the next few hours. But then, the flight attendant's cheerful announcement broke the silence. "We'd like to give a special thank you to Staff Sergeant Anderson for his service." Emma stiffened. The momentary calm shattered as a hushed conversation started around her. That single announcement opened the door to something she couldn't have anticipated, a revelation that would make this flight unforgettable and leave her questioning everything she thought she knew. What happened next would change not just Emma's day, but her entire perspective on life. Emma adjusted her headphones but found herself unable to focus on her playlist. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as passengers stole glances at Sergeant Anderson. Some smiled at him warmly, others whispered quietly. Emma, unsure why her curiosity was so piqued, turned her attention to the window. But even the mesmerizing clouds below couldn't distract her from the unspoken weight in the air. The soldier sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly together. Emma noticed a small photo tucked into the clear sleeve of his wallet, which he occasionally glanced at before slipping it back into his pocket. Something about the way he handled it caught her attention, gentle, as though it held the world for him. She tried not to stare, but her thoughts raced. Was it a family photo? A loved one he left behind? The flight attendant passed by again, offering drinks and snacks. "Would you like anything, Sergeant?" she asked with a respectful tone. He shook his head. "Just water, thank you," he replied softly, his voice carrying a polite firmness. Emma could sense there was more to his story, a quiet strength masking a deeper pain. Moments later, turbulence rattled the plane, causing Emma to grip the armrest. Sergeant Anderson, however, remained calm, though his knuckles whitened slightly as he held the seat in front of him. Emma thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear? No, it was something different. Regret, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Unable to contain her curiosity any longer, Emma finally spoke. "You fly often?" Her voice was casual, but her heart raced. The soldier turned to her, his expression kind yet guarded. "Not if I can help it," he admitted, offering a small smile. "But sometimes, you don't have a choice." Emma nodded, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to ask more, but didn't want to pry. Before she could decide, he continued, almost as if speaking to himself. "I have someone waiting for me in Boston. This flight isn't just a trip, it's important." The sincerity in his voice stirred something in Emma. She felt compelled to ask who, but she hesitated, sensing that his answer might reveal more than she was ready to hear. Instead, she said, "Well, I hope it's a good reunion." Sergeant Anderson's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look that was both tender and unbearably heavy. "I hope so too," he murmured, his gaze shifting to the window. The plane hummed along, but Emma's mind was anything but calm. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited him in Boston would be anything but ordinary. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm, but Emma couldn't stop glancing at Sergeant Anderson. Something about him felt different, like he carried more than just the weight of his duffel bag. She toyed with her water bottle, debating whether to ask him more questions. She didn't want to seem nosy, but her curiosity refused to fade. Eventually, the silence between them was broken when he shifted in his seat and winced, pressing a hand lightly against his ribs. Emma noticed the grimace, her instinct to help kicking in before she could stop herself. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone soft but concerned. Anderson hesitated, clearly unused to strangers showing concern. "Old injury," he said simply, his voice steady but guarded. "It acts up sometimes." Emma nodded, unsure whether to push further. She glanced at his hand, still gripping the photo he'd been looking at earlier. "Is that your family?" she ventured, her voice careful, trying not to cross a line. He followed her gaze and gave a faint smile, pulling the photo out to show her. It was a small snapshot of a little girl, her curly hair tied in pigtails and her face lit with a radiant smile. "My daughter," he said quietly. "Her name's Lily." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but there was something else there too. Worry, maybe even fear. Emma's heart softened. "She's beautiful," she said sincerely. "How old is she?" 5, he replied, his voice dropping slightly. "But she's been through more than most people face in a lifetime." He stopped, as though debating whether to say more. Finally, he added, "She's the reason I'm heading to Boston. There's a treatment there. One last option." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Emma felt her chest tighten, unsure how to respond. Before she could, the plane hit another pocket of turbulence, jolting them both. Anderson steadied himself, his jaw tightening as he looked out the window. "I'm not sure if it's going to work," he admitted, more to himself than to her. "But I have to try." For her. Emma found herself at a loss for words. She could feel the gravity of his situation, the desperation hidden beneath his composed exterior. She wanted to say something comforting, but nothing seemed adequate. Instead, she simply nodded, hoping he could sense her silent support. As the plane continued its journey, Emma's mind raced. She couldn't shake the image of the little girl in the photo, or the way Anderson's voice trembled when he spoke of her. Whatever was waiting for him in Boston, it wasn't just important, it was life-changing. And Emma had a growing feeling that, somehow, she was about to be pulled into his story in ways she couldn't yet understand. The plane began its descent, and the cabin grew quieter as passengers prepared for landing. Emma could feel the tension radiating from Sergeant Anderson beside her. His hands, now resting on his lap, clenched into fists. He stared ahead, his jaw tight, as though bracing for what awaited him. Emma didn't know why, but she couldn't ignore the unease that seemed to fill the air around him. As they touched down in Boston, Anderson let out a deep breath, one that seemed more like a release of nerves than relief. Emma decided to speak, unable to let him leave without offering something. "I hope everything goes well for Lily," she said softly, hoping her words carried the warmth she intended. He looked at her, his guarded expression softening for the first time. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. "She's strong, stronger than me, even. But I don't know if that'll be enough this time." Emma wanted to say more, to offer reassurance, but he stood before she could. Grabbing his duffel bag, Anderson gave her a small nod and made his way down the aisle. She watched him go, feeling a strange pull to follow. She had no real reason to, yet something about his story had rooted itself in her heart. As she stepped into the bustling terminal, Emma spotted Anderson at a distance. He was on the phone, his voice low but urgent. She hesitated, but the fragments of his conversation floated toward her. "No, I'll be there soon. Just keep her comfortable." "Yes, I understand. Please, don't let her be alone." Her chest tightened. The weight of his words was undeniable, and it struck her how much he was carrying. His uniform, his stoic demeanor, it was all a shield for the vulnerability he was trying to hide. Emma lingered, torn between walking away and approaching him. Her rational mind told her this wasn't her business, but her heart pushed her forward. She found herself taking a step closer, just as Anderson ended the call and ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion evident. Before she could say anything, a loudspeaker announced arrivals, and Anderson turned, his eyes scanning the terminal. Emma froze, unsure of what she would even say. But in that moment, their eyes met again, and for a brief second, the world seemed to pause. The announcement broke the moment, and Anderson gave her a faint, almost apologetic smile before turning and heading toward the exit. Emma watched him disappear into the crowd, her heart racing. She didn't understand why she felt so connected to a man she'd just met, but something told her this wasn't the last she'd see of him, or his story. Emma stood frozen in the terminal, watching Anderson vanish into the sea of travelers. The weight of his story lingered in her chest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this moment mattered more than she realized. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She barely knew him. This was his journey, not hers. Still, as she grabbed her bag and headed toward the exit, her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Just as Emma stepped outside to call a ride, a sharp commotion near the taxi stand caught her attention. A black duffel bag, Anderson's, had slipped off the curb and spilled its contents onto the pavement. Emma spotted him crouching to gather everything, clearly flustered, as papers and personal items scattered in the light breeze. Without thinking, she moved toward him, weaving through the crowd. "Need a hand?" she asked, kneeling beside him before he could answer. Anderson looked up, startled but grateful. "Thanks," he muttered, quickly shoving items back into his bag. Emma grabbed a sheet of paper that had fluttered near her feet, her eyes catching the bold heading at the top. Experimental treatment authorization. She hesitated, unsure if she should say anything, but Anderson noticed her glance. He sighed, sitting back on his heels. "That's Lily's last chance," he admitted, nodding toward the paper. "It's the only reason I'm here." Emma handed it back carefully, her curiosity growing. "Does the hospital know you're coming?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not exactly. The treatment's not guaranteed, neither the timing nor the funding. I'm here to push for both, but," he trailed off, his expression darkening, "I've already been told not to get my hopes up." Emma's chest tightened. The stakes were far higher than she'd realized. Before she could respond, a man in a suit approached Anderson, his expression stern. "Staff Sergeant Anderson?" the man asked, flashing an ID badge. "I'm from the hospital administration. We need to speak, urgently." Anderson stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Is something wrong with Lily?" The man hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's been a complication with the insurance coverage. We're trying to resolve it, but the treatment can't proceed until the payment is secured." Emma felt a cold chill run through her. Anderson's face paled, but his voice remained steady. "How long do I have to figure it out?" The man glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "Hours. Maybe less. I'm sorry, but we have other patients waiting, and resources are limited." As the man walked away, Anderson's shoulders slumped under the invisible weight pressing down on him. Emma's instincts screamed at her to intervene, though she had no idea how. Her heart raced as she realized this wasn't just his fight anymore. Somehow, she'd become part of it. Anderson stood frozen, staring at the retreating figure of the hospital administrator. His face betrayed no emotion, but Emma could see the turmoil beneath the surface. She felt an overwhelming urge to help, though she barely understood the complexities of his situation. Her voice broke the silence between them. "You can't give up now. Isn't there anyone you can call? Any backup plan?" He shook his head slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "I've already sold everything I could, taken every shift I could manage. Lily's care has drained everything. And now, with this," his voice faltered for the first time, his composure cracking, "I can't lose her." Emma's mind raced, grasping for a solution. She didn't know Anderson beyond this chance encounter, but something about his raw determination and love for his daughter ignited something in her. Before she could second-guess herself, she blurted, "What if I help? I know people, connections in Boston. I might be able to reach someone who can expedite the funding or find a workaround." Anderson looked at her, his guarded expression giving way to disbelief. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Emma hesitated, but then spoke with quiet conviction. "Because I've seen what you're fighting for, and I know what it's like to feel helpless when someone you love is depending on you." Without waiting for a response, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. Names from her past, colleagues, friends, anyone with influence, flashed through her mind as she explained the urgency of the situation. Hours stretched into minutes as the two of them waited outside the hospital, tension building with every passing second. Finally, Emma's phone buzzed with a call. She answered quickly, her heart pounding. The voice on the other end confirmed that a private donor had stepped in, matching the remaining funds needed for Lily's treatment. Relief washed over her, and she turned to Anderson, her eyes shining. "It's done. The treatment can move forward." Anderson exhaled sharply, his composure finally breaking. "You did it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her." But just as Emma smiled, feeling the weight of the moment, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message, a news alert. Her stomach dropped as she read the headline. "Anonymous donor saves child's life." Beneath it was a photo of her, snapped from the terminal earlier that day. Anderson glanced at her phone, his eyes narrowing. "You?" he asked, realization dawning. Emma froze, her carefully guarded secret unraveling. "It wasn't about recognition," she stammered. "I just wanted to help." Anderson studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You didn't have to, but you did," he said finally. "Lily won't just know her father fought for her. She'll know someone believed in her too." As the hospital doors opened, signaling the start of Lily's treatment, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. But beneath it all, she realized this wasn't just about Lily or Anderson. It was about a chance encounter that reminded her of the power of compassion, and how even the smallest actions can change lives forever. Emma stood by the hospital doors as Anderson disappeared inside, his steps quick but heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The relief on his face was unforgettable, but it was the unspoken gratitude in his eyes that stayed with her. She lingered for a moment, her heart full yet restless. She wasn't sure if she'd ever see him or Lily again, but she felt certain her small part in their story was complete. Later that evening, Emma sat in her quiet hotel room, replaying the events of the day. The news article about her anonymous donation had already gained traction, and her phone buzzed non-stop with messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. She silenced the notifications, realizing she didn't need their validation. What mattered was that a little girl had a fighting chance because of what they'd accomplished together. Days passed, and Emma couldn't stop thinking about Lily. She found herself checking the news for updates, hoping to see a sign that the treatment had worked. Just when she was starting to doubt she'd ever hear more, an unexpected message lit up her screen. It was from Anderson. He thanked her, not just for the donation, but for being there when he needed someone the most. His words were simple but sincere, and he included a photo of Lily in her hospital bed, giving a small but unmistakably hopeful smile. Emma's chest tightened as she stared at the picture. The fight wasn't over, but there was light ahead for both of them. Weeks turned into months. One morning, Emma received another message from Anderson, this time with a video. It was Lily, her hair growing back in soft wisps, standing unsteadily but proudly as she waved at the camera. "Thank you, Miss Emma," her sweet voice said. "Daddy says you're a real-life hero." Emma smiled through tears, feeling a warmth she hadn't known in years. This wasn't about being a hero. It was about realizing that even a single act of kindness could ripple into something extraordinary. As she watched the video again, Emma reflected on the chance encounter that had changed her life just as much as it had changed theirs. Sometimes, she thought, the most unexpected moments bring the greatest transformations. Emma closed her phone, a quiet resolve in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She'd never underestimate the power of a single, selfless choice.